Juneteenth, our now federal emancipation holiday. But let's talk a little bit about today. Today's program focuses on the history of Florida's emancipation. It was 159 years ago, this upcoming Monday, on May the 20th, 1865, that Union troops entered Tallahassee. They read Abraham Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation, they lowered the Confederate flag, and they raised once again the flag of the United States. And those groups of actions were very symbolic and very important. First and foremost, it represented the defeat of the Confederate States of America, who had been battling a war in part to preserve slavery in the United States. But secondly, on May 20th, with those actions, it freed the majority of people who had been enslaved here in the state of Florida. Approximately 12,000 of them were, as a part of that action, beginning along a path for freedom. And in the years since then, again, 159 years, we have seen in many communities, primarily in North Florida, that we have kept alive the tradition of May 20th, or May Day, as it came to be known. I'm a native of Live Oak, the county seat of Suwannee County, and I grew up celebrating May Day. I didn't know exactly what it was, but I know it was going to be food and games, and it was multi-generational. We were going to have a good time. But it wasn't until I began my career as a young public historian working at the John Gilmore Riley Center in Tallahassee, and one of my first assignments was to go out and recreate what Mr. Riley used to do with his students at Lincoln Elementary in commemorating May Day. And it was at that point that I connected this really old history to something I had experienced and that we were keeping alive in that city. And what I want to impress upon our audiences is that May 20th is Florida's oldest, one of its oldest emancipation celebrations, and is worthy of remembrance. But the full story of Florida's emancipations, plural, is much richer and much deeper. And that's what you'll get to learn a little bit more about with the premiere this afternoon of our mini documentary, Before Juneteenth, Florida's Emancipation. I just want to acknowledge a few folks in talking about this project. It was really inspired by Althemies Barnes. You heard me mention the John Gilmore Riley Center Museum in Tallahassee, Florida. I always tease Ms. Barnes that I was her first paid employee because she and Ms. Johnson were volunteers when they saved this home built in the 1890s by John Riley from demolition, and created what has become a very important cultural institution in that city and in our state. But it was her leadership in helping to preserve and celebrate May 20th in Tallahassee, as well as the founding of the Florida African American Heritage Preservation Network. We call it FAPN for short. And it's been her and those members who have helped to really spread the gospel, as the case may be, of Florida's Emancipation Day. And it was out of their concern that with the Juneteenth holiday, that May 20th would be overshadowed, that the idea for this project came into being. So I want to just recognize her by calling her name and thank her for all of her stewardship over the years and leadership when it comes to the preservation of Black Florida here in the state, as well as all of the other members of FAPN who are doing their individual parts all across the state to preserve local and state history as it relates to Black folks. I want to acknowledge the South Florida people of color. Ronnie Bennett is the executive director, and she's also one of the producers of this film. It was because of them that we were able to make this happen. I want to acknowledge Florida Humanities. It was because of their Broadcasting Hope media grant that we were able to build not only the website that we have to collect the historical documents, that's floridaemancipationmay20.com, but that we also were able to produce this film. I want to recognize Dr. Natalie King-Pedroso and the Cotton Bowl Collective. She was one of our key scholars that helped us with the collection and identification of individuals who could contribute both to the website and to the storytelling that you'll see tonight. Regina Phillips of the Lincolnville Museum in St. Augustine. I think they may be watching us live right now in St. Augustine. Regina, I want to thank you for your leadership and for being a part of this project. I want to recognize Jacksonville Councilwoman Jacoby Pittman and Adonica Toller, who are keeping the legacy of Eartha M.M. White intact at the museum there. They were also a part of this project, and you'll see their site in the film. Pasha Baker of the Goldsboro Museum in Sanford contributed photographs to our online collection. And last but not least, you'll get to hear from her a little later. I want to recognize Brittany Flowers of Blake and Blair Productions, who was our cinematographer for this effort and did some really beautiful work for us. Before we get into the film, I just want to take a moment and acknowledge our sponsors for this evening. The refreshments and reception that we'll go into after this event have been sponsored by the Friends of Arlick, so I'd like to thank them for their support of our institution and this project. I want to recognize Florida Blue and thank them for being here. They're tabling in the lobby. If you haven't yet, stop by and please find out more about their services, but we appreciate their support. I'd like to thank Educa Vision, that's led by Fakir Vilsant and Maud Huller. They were contributors last year and this year to our Celebrating Freedom series, and I just want to thank them. And then lastly, I would like to acknowledge and thank Sala South Florida, Charlene Farrington, who you'll also hear from a little later, as well as Gene Tinnie. We all have been with that organization as founding members of the South Florida branch. We want to let you know that we're still here and still alive and still doing the work and need your contributions to that. Okay, with that, I will conclude my comments and invite you to enjoy our mini documentary, Before Juneteenth, Florida's Emancipations.
The observance, the historical date of May 20th, 1865, which is Emancipation Day, is what I grew up, and others like me grew up knowing it as, is the date when African Americans enslaved in Florida were freed from slavery.
It's interesting the way that we think about Florida in the modern era. We tend to think of it as less southern. We tend to associate the state with beaches and Disney and tourism. But the reality is that Florida is quintessentially southern. It's southern in every way possible, and that includes our history. Slavery has played a significant role in the development of this state.
As we look at this whole history of emancipation in Florida, we would be grossly remiss and way off the mark if we didn't consider and actually start with the self-emancipators, going all the way back to the 1600s and before that. I mean, I think the first attempt to establish slavery in Florida by the Spanish was in 1526. So in 1693, we have the Spanish King's Edict, where he decides to authorize and encourage enslaved people to come to Florida, where they could serve as a buffer and a defense force to protect the Spanish interest.
When we talk about the early Black presence here, there's a mixed bag. We do have the fact that there was Spanish colonization here with the establishment of St. Augustine in 1565. But within that, there were opportunities for freedom for Black folks. So it's very interesting and very important for us to realize in this colonial era, Florida was a site of freedom where African Americans could escape servitude and slavery in the British North American colonies and come and convert to Catholicism in Florida and be able to live lives as free people. That is what makes Fort Mose significant as the first formally recognized free settlement for Black Americans in this colonial experiment. Florida becomes a state in 1845, and it is with statehood that the practices that had already existed in terms of slavery are going to be extended and codified into state law. Florida then and now still has significant agricultural development. There's cotton being grown in the state, other major cash crops, and there is a significant enslaved population that is mainly contained between the Apalachicola River and the Swanee River. By the time we get to 1865, there are approximately 63,000 Black people in the state. Only 1,000 of them are free. So the vast majority of Black people living in the state of Florida are in kind of that old Black belt of the region and are enslaved. As we get into the 1830s and the rise of the abolitionist movement, and the 1840s and 50s, with more political and social pressure and contest over where slavery should exist or not, the push for the abolition of slavery, you're really going to see this fraying of American society and American politics. And even though in many southern states it was illegal for enslaved Black people to learn to read and write, you best understand that they had their ear to the ground, and they understood very clearly that this growing conflict between the Republican Party in the North territorially and the desire to preserve slavery in the South meant that there would be opportunity in that chasm for them to seek freedom. We need to appreciate that the position of the Republican Party, which elected Abraham Lincoln in 1860, was not abolition. That was politically untenable, and they knew it. They were very interested, however, in trying to contain what we knew as slave power, that the outsized influence and economic power that was represented by these southern states. Southerners, conversely, could not hear that. They only heard that there was abolition coming, and it was the way that they talked about this that convinced their enslaved people that there was opportunity for freedom in this. And so from the very beginning of the outbreak of war in 1861, what you're going to see is that masses of Black people are going to flee to the side of the U.S. Army, later known as the Union Army, in attempts to free themselves. And the Union Army was wholly unprepared to deal with that phenomenon. Even in early phases of the war, they were returning these fugitive slaves back to their owners in the South. It was only when they recognized that their power, their human work was being used to support the Confederacy in their war efforts that they stumbled upon the idea of labeling fugitive slaves as contraband. That would be used to aid the war efforts of their enemy, and as such that they would not return them to their owners. And so when you talk about this process of freedom and process towards emancipation, it's important to recognize the agency that enslaved Black peoples exercised during this period when they recognized what was potentially before them.
The big reason for the enslavement of people in the Florida Keys was the construction of the forts here. A lot of the slave owners here in Key West would rent the people that they own to the government for the construction of those forts.
January 1st, 1863, Emancipation Proclamation goes into effect in very limited areas. It's a piece of paper. It can't take effect until a couple of things have happened. Either federal troops have shown up and control a particular piece of geography, or that they actually have ended the war. And those things don't happen until April of 1865, when there's the surrender of the Confederacy at the Appomattox Courthouse. It's only then that full emancipation as we know it, the news of it, and the enforcement of it can move forward. And it's going to travel at the speed of horseback.
Emancipation Day in Key West was much different. Key West, the Florida Keys, were, for the entirety of the Civil War, under Union control. They were never a part of the Confederacy. And so even though people were enslaved here and they're working on these forts, When Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation, it took a little while for word to get down here, but about 3 weeks after the Emancipation Proclamation was issued, they did get word, and everybody celebrated. Once they realized that slavery's over, they held a big parade and a celebration that says went well into the night. There's this wonderful account of Sandy Cornish leading this parade of newly freed people, hobbling because that's how he walked, because he had actually maimed himself years earlier. But the pride, the joy that he felt, that day had come. And there it was, and he was leading the parade.
January 1st was always the day here in St. Augustine. And so the celebration was immediate after the reading of the Emancipation at the government house here. It was celebrated, and then the people of the town were all called together. It was read to them collectively. And January of 1864, an invitation went out for a celebration in St. Augustine at that time. Barbara Vickers, who is now 98 years old, she's still alive in our community. She recalled when she was a little girl how much fun she had staying up and watching the people decorate the floats for the parade. And it was a big deal for her, at that time.
Yes, emancipation does go into effect on January 1st of 1863 with the signing of the Emancipation Proclamation. And it was something that was looked forward to with great anticipation by enslaved Black folks. So knowing that this date was coming, this transition from slavery to freedom was coming, there are African Americans who are going to group themselves together, come together in this religious almost observance, waiting for the clock to strike midnight on December 31st, 1862, knowing that the next day that their lives would be changed because of the signing of the Emancipation Proclamation. This happens in areas like Washington, D.C., along the coast of South Carolina, which there's a large federal presence. And we continue to observe the occasion of what we commonly know as Watch Night, watching the new year ring in. Not many people know, it's only been a more recent discovery that that tradition of Watch Night was also a part of the march forward of emancipation. Emancipation was not the intended consequence of the U.S. Civil War. Because of the length of the war, because of the tremendous loss of life, Abraham Lincoln does come to it as an idea that he could put forward as a way, he hopes, to end hostilities, to get Southerners, the Confederacy, to come to the negotiating table. And it's going to be that process, that thought process, that strategy that encourages him to create what we know as the preliminary Emancipation Proclamation. This is September the 22nd, 1863, where he's announcing that in 100 days in those states that are in combat against the United States of America, that all of their slaves would be free. There are some exceptions, of course. There are border states that are exempted from this, and people have pointed that out as controversial. But what you have to understand is that all of this is strategy of a wartime president whose ultimate goal is not to end slavery, but to keep the Union together.
Though the Emancipation was signed on January 1st, 1863, the word did not reach Florida until May 20th, 1865. In the Tallahassee community where the official reading took place, though that reading was to impact the entire state of Florida, over 60-some thousand slaves were freed with that enforcement reading.
After the slaves were freed, they was sometime in a period of frustration because being enslaved all those years like that, they never experienced anything like that.
You had that first phase of, all right, we're supposed to be free, but we're not free yet. And now the soldiers finally show up, the cavalry shows up. Well, okay, what does that mean?
It took over a period of time to get themselves adjusted. You see, when Cook McCook read the Emancipation Proclamation. That was an event. That wasn't a celebration. So they took 2 years before they started celebration at Bugle Pond, which is now Lake Ella. Bugle Pond really was a pond where the slaves fished. And when they were emancipated in slavery, they went there and had that first celebration. It moved from there over to Winthrop property right across the street over there, and it was celebrated there for 58 years. And then it moved here in 1924. And we've been celebrating the 20th of May for something in this area for about 98 years. What they did on May Day, they planted the maypole, and that was a old English tradition. That was one of the main activities that we did here. And there were some large and majestic pines there. And coming up to the 20th of May, they would take a lime and painted the base of the trees white with lime, and they would decorate the stage, and every young person in the community had to go on stage and say like a poem or speech or something like that. After slavery, the Union soldiers, they didn't have a need for the drum because the war was over, so they didn't need a drum corps. So they gave the drums to the ex-slaves, and the ex-slaves, they designed a unique beat, and they was beating it. The beat lasted for 100 and something like over 50 years. Now, and what happened was the drum beat was a part of every family, and every family taught their young children to beat the drums. When I was 8 years old, my grandfather had the drums, which are in that front room there, and that's the drums my brother and I learned to beat on. And over the years, we became some of the best drum beaters in Leon County.
I recall having a conversation with one of our elders, Mrs. Lil Mitchell, and she mentioned that there was a white gentleman who would donate a whole hog back in the day. The men would dig a pit the night before, and then the whole hog would cook for the entire time, and apparently it was some real good eating back in the day.
Well, I remember when we celebrated it when I was a kid in elementary school. That's how far back I remember. We would go to school that day. I would get to ride the bus to go to New Bethel, and the women would be working all day to get all the food and stuff ready for us by the time we got there.
The first celebration that I knew of as a child growing up, well, hearing it from my parents, took place 2 years later in 1867. And that celebration started on the old plantation place, because now they are free, so we say they were still some on the plantation, so it was held on the plantation. My great-grandmother, Debbie Edwards, along with a good friend of hers, Sarah Hill, started that celebration. We looked forward to going, the children, because there was a lot of playtime, a lot of food. But first they told us why we were there, is to celebrate freedom. And then we would go outside or play around in the old school hide and seek. Coming up, it was just that commonality of history that everybody knew this was an important time. For that reason, I just think it's so important that this particular history does not get eclipsed with some of the today fanfare or hype that's going on as it relates to emancipation.
Emancipation parades kind of went underground, and they ceased in the middle of the Jim Crow era here in St. Augustine. And I can only imagine after word of what happened in Ocoee and, Greenwood and different places that, people were fearful for their lives.
As best as I can tell from the oral histories that I've conducted, you do see a decline in the veracity of these 20th of May celebrations over the years. I link it based on the chronology to the desegregation of schools. When schools were segregated, Black principals, Black teachers had the ability to make it a school holiday and to incorporate it into the curriculum, to release students from school, to transport students from the school grounds to the communal celebration locations. a lot of that control they will lose when schools are desegregated, and you now have white administrators and white teachers determining this holiday schedule. And so it's really about then, even though we have Brown versus Board of Education in 1954, the reality of desegregation in Florida does not play out until the 1960s and 70s, and it's going to be about that time that you see in the central part of Florida these celebrations really fading.
A lot of hearing about it came about because of Juneteenth. As Juneteenth became more popular and began to be observed more in different places around the country, that's when you started hearing more that, well, that was Texas. What about our story here in Florida? This was a very profound experience and something not to be brushed aside and something not to just be a footnote in history.
There is kind of a contest in some people's mind between the recognition of May 20th in Florida versus Juneteenth. I think for sure we want to make sure that we preserve and pay tribute to the history of the events that took place in our state, most especially those communities, those tradition keepers, those community folk who invested their time and energy each year to make sure that these were festive occasions for the community. Many of these were women. So when we talk about the role of women in weaving the fabric of community, we have to place the 20th of May and those celebrations firmly within that context. The other part of it, though, I think when we think about Juneteenth, it's important to recognize the kind of culmination, symbolic as it may be, of the announcement of the Emancipation Proclamation. I love the old adage that until all of us are free, none of us are free. And so in my mind, celebrating Juneteenth also has real significance. All of these holidays together, whether you're talking about the 20th of May, Juneteenth, or the 4th of July, all have a very important place in helping us to tell our national history. Not everyone entered our body politic, our society, this American democracy at the same point, in telling a more complicated story about America, and specifically understanding our transition away from chattel slavery into emancipation and this long road towards freedom that we continue to move along. All of that is important, and our public holidays have a role in telling that story.
I think it is important to continue to celebrate history. To forget the past denies future generations and present generations their heritage and a foundation for hope. Plus, for me, I think that knowing history and understanding it is at the root of intelligence.
It puts us in a position where Emancipation Day is kind of important in its own right, but it's also important as a vehicle, if you will, that connects us, that opens the way for us to reclaim that greater picture, that greater understanding of our being, our existence, our purpose.
Emancipation is not a frivolous event. It's solemn, it's sacred, and that needs to be taught and passed on.
As a young public historian working with the John Riley Museum in Altham-East Barnes, that was one of my first professional tasks, was to help to organize the commemoration of Florida Emancipation Day. We were very interested in recreating what we know John Gilmore Riley had done when he was principal at Lincoln Academy, which was have his students come and decorate the graves of the U.S. colored troops who were buried in Old City Cemetery. That then rolled into a commemoration at the Knott House that is still going on today. Move forward a few more years, and then in 2021, with the federal recognition of the Juneteenth Independence holiday, there became real concern here in the state of Florida among historic preservationists that this new federal holiday would overshadow nearly 160 years of domestic emancipation celebrations here in the state of Florida. And what I recognized in talking to Ms. Barnes and Natalie King and others is that we hadn't done the best job of educating people. We needed to really coordinate our efforts to make sure that we had an authoritative source of information for the citizens of Florida to really help them to understand this history that so many of us held dear, but we needed to make sure that more people knew. And so this 20th of May Digital History Project is our effort to make sure that we preserve the history, preserve the stories, and document Florida's historic Emancipation Day. It's wonderful, really, to see what I would class as a resurgence of the 20th of May celebrations. A lot of this I grounds in credit to the John Gilmore Riley Museum, the Florida African American Heritage Preservation Network, as well as the Department of State, which has been a real champion of the holiday, both on the web and through the annual celebrations that are held at the Knott House Museum. And we now see more prominent celebrations taking place throughout the state, where we're bringing people together, we're helping to educate them. For a lot of our elders, it is a return of something that has faded over the years. One really positive outcome of this work is helping to spread the word and create more celebration, more curiosity, more research, and more actual celebration of the 20th of May across the state of Florida. Some faces you will recognize, some we will introduce you to. Nope, you can sit anywhere you like. Okay. Now, for those of you who watch the film, raise your hand if this is new information for you. Learning about the 12. Okay, I think that might be the majority of people. Now, how many people grew up celebrating May Day, May 20th? I know I was talking to Ms. Glenn earlier, Mr. Watkins. So there are a few of us who know about it. But I'm encouraged by the fact that we're able to share and give people something new. I want to start with Charlene. Charlene is the executive director of the Spady Cultural Heritage Museum up the street in Delray. Round of applause for that. She is also currently the president of the South Florida branch of the Association for the Study of African American Life and History. But Charlene, you at the Spady have been keeping alive May 20th here in South Florida. I wondered if you would talk to us a little bit about the legacy of May 20th at Spady.
The Spady Museum started celebrating Emancipation Day in 2010. The museum opened in 2001. And in 2010, a local, our founders board, our elders in the community who talked to us about the history, education, provided our historical documents. So one of our elders came to the museum and sat the staff down and explained May 20th and Emancipation. And this is why I think we needed her to do this. In our area, many people who settled in the Delray Beach and the Palm Beach County area who are of African descent, many of them came from the Caribbean islands, the Bahamas, Haiti, Jamaica, Dominican Republic. And they don't necessarily celebrate emancipation in the United States. They celebrate their own emancipation days. So it was the other half of the community of people of African descent who all came from other parts of the country, by the way, that really needed to be reminded in some cases and educated in other cases about emancipation in Florida. We have a lot of people that came from the Gullah Geechee coastline that settled in our area. A lot of people from the Georgia area, and then some from North Florida. So they arrive in Palm Beach County, they establish the community, and by the way, they arrive after all of this has happened. Our communities weren't settled until after the Civil War. And as we know, it wasn't necessarily a good thing to publicly celebrate a holiday that is really relevant to people of African descent. It didn't go over well with people of other cultures in the community, let me put it that way. So it was primarily focused around the churches. The churches were the ones who drove the celebrations, who planned the programs, who opened up their buildings and their grounds for the types of celebrations that took place. And those of us growing up in these communities, we knew we were celebrating May Day, but we didn't know the history behind it, right? And now that I'm older and have talked to people, done oral histories in the area, I'm realizing that the generation before me, a lot of those people didn't realize what they were celebrating either. So it took some education to make people understand what we are celebrating. What are we talking about? What went on in May that we're celebrating? So the Spady Museum took that on, and starting in 2010, we started celebrating Juneteenth. But we would, on that day, talk about Florida's emancipation, not Texas, right? So we would use the holiday to talk about our own Emancipation Day. And now that Juneteenth is a national holiday, we simply continue with that practice. We start celebrating what we now call Emancipation season. So we start on May 20th with our celebrations. And quite frankly, and I just have to say this, there is so much to learn and to talk about that has to do with emancipation in the United States, that we can spend every day of emancipation season rolling out a new program that talks about a different topic that has to do with people who were enslaved in the U.S. and how they became emancipated and where we are now. Because as we know, emancipation is not a date, it's a process.
Thank you for that. So 13 years going strong at Spady. Thank you for your leadership. That reminds me, your comments remind me of something else that we talked about in the documentary, and that is that watch night, another observance that I grew up with in my church, has its roots as an emancipation celebration. How many of you were aware of that before tonight? A few of you. I have to say that it was just a few years ago before those dots were connected for me. So there are all of these elements that are rooted in emancipation that are necessary for us to talk about. I want to broaden our lens a little bit and bring in Dinizulu Gene Tinnie, artist and scholar. If he tells me I'm doing something right, I know I'm doing something right. I'm really grateful for your continued input and your agreement to be a part of this project. But I wondered if you would talk to us about the international realities of, while we're talking about emancipation, we try to have a conversation about independence, especially tomorrow being Haitian Flag Day. It is a part of this observance of independence on that island. And when that happens in 1803 and 1804, the disruption that it creates in this hemisphere, while it takes it many, many years, decades to really have the impact of liberation in the United States, there is definitely a connection between the Haitian Revolution and the end of slavery, not only in the United States, but throughout the Caribbean. I wonder, Mr. Tinnie, if you could take some time and try to put that into context for our audience.
Sure, and you know, thanks for asking, as they say. I think you really put your finger on the real issue, if you will, of emancipation. You know, there tends to be a lot of focus on the dates, the holidays, the celebrations, even questions of who or what gets funded, and certainly what should not be lost in in our observances of this is the fact that, as we heard Mrs. Barnes say in the video, this is a sacred occasion. But and as Charlene, as you just said, it's not just an occasion. The process of emancipation is still going on. You know, we're not. You know, are we there yet? No. But I'm glad you brought up the global aspect of it, because for us, and when I say us, I mean as African people, but as a race, meaning a human race, for us to really understand history, we have to start looking at it as in global terms, looking at our interaction as a species, not only within and among ourselves, but with the rest of nature and all of that. In our traditional knowledge systems, none of that is strange. That's not exotic. There was no other way to understand history. You always understood that you were part of the land, the wind, the waters, and everything else. And so even though that sounds kind of exotic and far-fetched today, or like some kind of new age fad, it's really nothing more than coming back to our back when common sense was more common. And specifically, when we look at this emancipation season, and look at just these 4 days, and okay, today is the anniversary of the Brown versus Board Supreme Court decision that ended any pretense that segregation in schools, much less anywhere else, had any kind of legal basis or constitutional basis. Tomorrow, the 18th, is the anniversary of the 1896 Plessy v. Ferguson decision that allowed for segregation and all of that to go into place in the first place. You mentioned Haitian Flag Day, which is tomorrow, kind of the centerpiece of Haitian Heritage Month. And I'll circle back to what that means, because there's so much significance attached to the Haitian Revolution. May 19th is the anniversary of the birth of Malcolm X, iconic personality. He was assassinated more than 50 years ago. More than 3/4 of the population today is under 50 years of age. So, we have a whole generation coming of age who does not have a real idea of who personalities like that were. Just, like my generation, hearing about people like Marcus Garvey or Father Divine, these were sort of, exotic names. And of course, the 20th is Emancipation Day in Florida. May 22nd is Emancipation Day in Martinique. Today, they don't call it a French colony, but it's considered an overseas, territory, department of France. But it's interesting there that the enslaved people on that island got the word long before the official word got to the island, and they just let the governor know, no, forget waiting for the ship. This happens now, okay? Basically, that's what happened, and that transfer of knowledge is a significant part of the story. When the Haitian Revolution succeeded, slaveholders in the United States, here in North America and other places, did all they could to suppress knowledge of that. Forget it. There was in no way. The people knew. And the Haitian Revolution had a number of significant immediate impacts. One, you have library shelves groaning under the weight of books talking about what a genius, military genius Napoleon was. I'm not a genius, but I kind of look at it and say, well, you know, if the farther you go, the wider the front gets and you keep going, that doesn't sound too smart. But the fact that he was defeated by Africans. The main participants in the Haitian Revolution were African-born. They weren't even born in Haiti. His loss of Haiti, every day, every time we hear about Haiti, the news is bad through the news media. It's the poorest country, it's this, it's that. It's hard for some of us to believe that Haiti was far and away the richest colony in the entire hemisphere. Haiti provided fully 40% of the wealth that France had. That's what financed Napoleon's military adventures and misadventures. And by the way, it also gets forgotten that in all of the fervor of the Haitian Revolution and their, espousing of liberty, fraternity, and equality, basically they abolished slavery. One of the first things Napoleon did when he put the crown on his own head was to reinstate slavery, and particularly in the Caribbean. So in a lot of ways, he got his just desserts for that. But his loss of Haiti and the strategic and economic value of that island made it imperative for him to sell what the French then claimed as a Louisiana territory, which was not, of course, just the state of Louisiana that we know today, but that whole territory that actually doubled the size of the United States when it was sold to the United States under Thomas Jefferson. And from there we get the Lewis and Clark expedition and all of that. The big dream of the American slaveholders was that this vast territory would be this great place for slavery to expand into. And well, there's a whole narrative, as we know, that spins off of that. Haiti became this beacon of hope for the whole hemisphere.
Absolutely.
And I'll just mention one significant example. We know of the city of, the nation of Bolivia in South America. We know that the money in some of those are in Panama and Venezuela, the Bolivar. Simón Bolivar, who led the independence struggle for that northern tier of South America, the Spanish Main, as it used to be called, he was supported. He went to Haiti. He was trained in Haiti, and he was supported by Haiti. Haiti used their wealth to intercept slave ships and just, look, here's your money. You want money? Here's money. And liberate those people here. So when we look at Flag Day, when we look at this whole natural cause that all humans have to be free, and how it swept through, enslaved African communities and spread from there, we get a much better idea of what emancipation meant. And the last thing I'll say is, let's not lose sight of the fact that while the dates are important, what we really want to tap into is what was the actual experience of those people once they were told that slavery is over? What did that mean? And on the one hand, yes, there's a military presence that is there to protect your rights, but what rights do you have? What property do you have? What hope do you have? And how those ancestors negotiated that reality is one of the real key points that we want to learn.
Absolutely. Thank you for that. You brought that home brilliantly. And it brings me to something that's on my mind is, many times as we're looking at Juneteenth and even May 20th, it is celebration. It's about bringing community together. But I also think that it's important, and I hope that as this continues, we can add more to this. How do we deal with the legacy of slavery? For me, I don't think that we talk enough about our ancestors that survived that period. Many times when I think about these emancipation celebrations, I really get caught up and emotional about what that moment must have been like for them, whether they actually heard the reading of the Emancipation Proclamation, or when they got the news, or when they were able to leave the plantation or be reunited with their families. I think that the survival techniques that have brought us to the moment of emancipation and even brought us to this very moment are a very rich and important part of our culture and identity as people of African descent, whether we're here in the United States or anywhere. That's our birthright is that strength. Charlene?
And I think those survival techniques are what make our culture, our people, so interesting to people of other cultures. Because, it takes you 5 minutes to sit down and think, if my ancestor had decided they were not going to cross, they were not going to make that journey to the United States, they were going to end their lives right then, I wouldn't be here, right? If my ancestors...
Because people like to romanticize.
They do.
Killmonger, right?
Right.
And Black Panther.
Right. But it's our strength of will, it's our strength to survive that is baffling to a lot of other cultures, and that keeps them close to us in certain aspects in an attempt to figure out how it is, how do we do that? How do you do it? And I've had people say to me as the director of the Spady Museum, how come you're still here? How do you keep this museum going? Because they know what our budget is like. But no, it's something to really, and I think it would make a very interesting additional topic to talk about, because there were not all kinds, but there were different options for people who were newly emancipated. And you hear about people who stayed right where they were. You hear about people who left. The people who created our communities came to this area looking for a better way of life. All of that takes courage and takes strength, whatever the choice is you make.
And as you talk about emancipation, one of my favorite periods of history is that period of Reconstruction, when you look at now that the yoke of slavery has been taken away, once they are defined as citizens with the 14th Amendment, once Black men have the right to vote, what type of society are America's newest citizens interested in creating? We would not have public education as we know it if it was not for the demands of those newly freed Black citizens. Many of our HBCUs were created during this period as well because of the demand. And there was a very direct connection that's important to us being in an institution like the African American Research Library and Cultural Center. Part of the reason that slavery was as pervasive and has lasted as long as it did is because it was legally forbidden to teach Black people to read and write. You can't enslave someone if they have the ability to reason, to deal with the Constitution, to deal with the law. And so I think for folks who were coming to the side of emancipation, they instantly understood that in order to maintain this freedom for myself and my children and grandchildren, we had to have the thing that they prevented us from having. We had to have literacy. And when you talk about impact, when you look at the transition and the way that Black people became literate in those early years, they've never seen anything like it in the history of humankind. When you look at those literacy rates and how they increase.
And I agree with you 100%. That period of time when we went through what is called desegregation, and our teachers lost control of our students, and I'm talking about people of African descent, that was the break point. That was the point at which we could no longer keep the next generations informed and up to date on our history. We had to find other ways to share that history with our children. We no longer had access to our children all day long during school to make sure that they had that information. So it was transitionary period where we had to learn how to operate differently.
Sure. And again, history repeats itself because we are yet again in a climate where there are some people who want less of the truth of the history, who want less of the slavery stories to be shared with other folks. And the question is always, what are we going to do? But if we understand this history and these examples, we know what to do. We saw our ancestors activate to create out of nothing. Again, they were released with no, this conversation about reparations. There was none of that. There was no check. There was no, land. Right, severance. Oh wow, that's no severance pay. Yes, when they left those plantations, but it was through sheer will and working together that they were able to make that happen. I want to pivot a little bit and bring Brittany into this conversation. Brittany Flowers was our videographer for the project. She did a wonderful job. Don't you agree? So, and I'm sensitive. You're the non-historian here.
Absolutely.
But I did want to give you an opportunity to talk about your experience because you traveled the state capturing this footage. You saw footage from Key West, Jacksonville, Tallahassee, as well as here for this. But talk about what you experienced and what you learned on this project.
Yeah, like you said, Dr. Hobbs, I'm definitely not a historian, but I came in here knowing nothing about Emancipation Day at all. And I actually came in here as the videographer. This is just another project. This is just another video I'm shooting, and I'm out of here and I'm done. Driving to Key West, I would say the story about Key West was the most profound to me because first time being to Key West, my dad rode down with me. I'm like, okay, I'm a tourist. I'm going to go visit here, the beach. I had a mindset of enjoying myself but doing my job. But I came out of there with an experience. I know you all talked about what they feel like, what happened there. And I would say when I visit Fort Wayne, which is where they housed the slaves during that time, I felt like I experienced what they felt like before they found out that they were freed. So as I'm going into Fort Wayne, it's this kind of a long trail that you get to before you go to the place where the slaves were held. And I'm a scary cat. So I'm walking down there looking, over my shoulder like, oh my gosh, is somebody going to come out of these woods or, behind these trees and get me or something like that? And so at that moment, I was like, what did the slaves think as they were getting off the ship, coming into, this place? Were they afraid? How did they feel? And then as I go into this area where it's an open area, as you've seen in the video, you can see these things that kind of look like dungeons, chambers, and things like that. So I put myself, how many people were in here? How did they feel being in this small space? You can barely stand up, crowded area. Just thinking about how they were treated during this time. They also had this section where you can walk up to the top of, again, this establishment or whatever it was, and I thought about in that moment, wow, just beyond here, you could see, quote unquote, freedom, but you can't get it. What if they wanted to escape? They can see the ocean right there. They could see freedom right beyond this place, but they can't get there. As I came back down to where everything else was, then I see this place that's restricted where, you can't go. But there were even smaller rooms, looked like it was very dark, no windows or anything like that. So then my mind went to, could they see? How did they feel in these moments of a enclosed place as it was? And then a few steps later, I go to where there are just cannons everywhere, cannons that they would shoot off. What were they thinking when they heard these noises? They didn't know anything that was going on. Again, this was during the Civil War time as well. So just the way that it looked, everything was just so dark, eerie feeling and everything like that. And so just wondering what they were really experiencing during that time, putting myself, and there was this one hallway that I walked down. You could see again, maybe you could stick your head through. It wasn't a big window at all. It kind of felt like a prison to me. I've never been to prison, but I've seen what they look like on TV. But it kind of felt like that. Even them looking out again into the water, into the ocean, seeing these ships, bringing different people, again, what went through their mind. And then after I left there, I went to the memorial site where I think it was about 250 slaves were buried there. And, I'm taking it all in, still experiencing that this was their resting place. Here they are going from being slaves, walk to this fort, to finding out that they're free, and, then some of them being buried right where I'm standing. There are people, because it's right on the beach. And so here you are seeing people on the beach enjoying themselves and everything like that, and I'm here taking in that I am standing where slaves were buried. So that was an experience in itself for me, and I saw some young kids just skating around and rolling around on it. I'm like, if only you knew the significance of this landmark, you probably would look at this a little bit differently.
Yeah, and you did such a beautiful job of capturing that footage and packaging everything. I can't say enough about your brilliance. We worked on a number of different video pieces together, but I'm just so proud of the work that you did here and the way that you brought the story to life. So thank you for your talent. But side note, you would be interested to know that the person who put that memorial that you're describing, the African burial ground in Key West, is none other than Dinizulu Gene Tinnie. Baba, you want to take a...
Thank you.
And that brings up, Key West is really important. I'd like for you to talk a little bit more about the African burial ground and give us that full story, and talk about Key West as a site of really one of the earliest emancipation celebrations that we have on record. We don't really think about Key West in that way. And while even starting this project, our focus was really on May 20th. That's when the majority of Black people were freed. You have to deal, if you're going to tell with the full story, with Key West and Fernandina and the east side of Florida being able to be emancipated almost 2 years earlier in 1863. So again, this goes back to the point of there are many dates and many occasions where we see freedom flowing, emancipation flowing, but Key West is a really important site. Tell us a little bit more about the African burial ground and how emancipation came to Key West.
Yeah, gladly. You're right. I mean, there are multiple connections. I would, if I may, just do a quick detour just to touch on a point that several of us, and that's the business of education. The beginning of emancipation, or emancipation was the beginning of Reconstruction. This was the most hopeful period in American history. What most of us don't realize is that we talk about public schools. The whole public, when we talk about districts and superintendents, that entire model came out of early Reconstruction, South Carolina, primarily Black leadership, because, and this is a point that's made very strongly in Montgomery by the Equal Justice Initiative, that established the lynching memorial. When slavery ended, without a doubt, the second highest priority that everybody had who had been enslaved was literacy and education. The only priority higher than that was finding scattered family members. But this was an absolute imperative because they knew that this was the key to, empowerment. So that that legacy that actually it was designed to save the whole country because they wanted literacy and education for everybody, free public education. Of course, the racists wanted to reject that, and we have that. So, but I wanted to just make sure that became part of our discussion. So Key West is the southernmost point in the continental United States. Therefore, it is geographically closest to all of the predominant trafficking routes of the Middle Passage, into Central America, the Caribbean, South America, even though Charleston is the #1 point of importation into North America. And it's sometimes, surprising to find that only less than 5% of all of that global trafficking actually came to North America, for considering the influence that African North America has had on on the rest of the world. Key West has a very interesting distinction, which is that of all the Africans who came, slavery existed in Key West, and if when the fugitive Fugitive Slave Act was enacted, and you were black in Key West, yes, you could be fair game. But it's interesting that the Africans who came into, none of them came in to be put on auction blocks. Those Africans, the ones that you, the cemetery and that incident took place in 1860. Prior to that, in 1828, there was a illegal slave ship, Spanish slave ship called the Guerrero that foundered, is being pursued by a British ship, exchanging gunfire. Both ships ended up running aground off Key Largo. That story outdoes any Hollywood movie script that could ever have been written in terms of what those Africans went through. I would just encourage people to look up the Guerrero Project, Guerrero. That was the name of the ship. Long story short, 120 of the people who survived that came to Key West. There were all kinds of rumors swirling that the Cubans were going to come and claim them. So they were sent to St. Augustine for safety. And eventually, some of them made it back to Africa, not to where they came from, but to Liberia. Fast forward to 1860, we're on the brink of the Civil War. In fact, it's all but inevitable by this point. The United States finally starts taking its treaty obligations seriously to be suppressing American citizens participating in this human trafficking. They captured 3 slave ships on their way to Cuba, and they bring a total of 1,432 Africans into Key West, the closest port. Those folks are welcomed by the community. The community was only 3,000 people, so you add like 1,500, it's almost like, half the size of the existing population. They provided clothing, blankets, food. The U.S. Marshal hastily was able to build housing. And their presence there for 12 weeks became quite a national sensation. Journalists and curiosity seekers came from all around the country to see this spectacle. There were interesting stories. One, for example, okay, these folks, and Brittany, you alluded to it. I mean, it's all of this uncertainty of, what was going to happen to us, and then you're rescued by people who are obviously mean you more good than the people that were capturing you before. But where is all of this leading? And there's when the people were landed from the first ship called the Wildfire, and they were sort of settled. A second ship gets captured, and as they're ferrying the people in, some of the Africans who are being brought into Key West, they know they're being rescued. And they're singing this song of joy. One woman who was on shore hears the song and says, "Oh my God, that's somebody from," and it turned out it was one of her family members. And so you had these extraordinary kinds of human dramas, which really kind of points to that same all lives matter, 1,432 Africans, and you see these diagrams and all, but when you really think of these were all individual lives, people who actually had families and loved ones and communities and dreams and aspirations and abilities and talents. And of those 1,432, 295 of them did not survive the conditions that they had endured, and they died in Key West. And then they're buried, those who know Key West would know Higgs Beach on the south shore of the island. And there was a kind of a Potter's Field cemetery, researchers think, and that's where they were buried. And that story finally came to light. It was kind of gone into obscurity. It was sort of rediscovered in 1996 by a Florida Keys historian named Gail Swanson, who also wrote the book about the Guerrero that I alluded to.
But you did the work on the memorial that's there, that is absolutely beautiful.
I didn't get to design the whole memorial, but I got to be the lead designer on the artwork that we put there, the map and the Adinkra symbols and writing the plaques and all of that. And when you go there, we're reminded all the time of how divided the country is. But just those of us who are old enough to remember when the TV version of Roots aired and the whole country tuned in, when you go there, I think I might have gone to that of the many times I've been there. I think I could count 2, maybe 3 times. And one was when it was raining, that I did not see somebody there at that site reading every one of those plaques, looking at the people wanting to take pictures. There is a hunger and a thirst. People want to know exactly what you were alluding to. I mean, there's been this global interest. That's why, when people hear jazz and they hear blues and spirituals, and how do you survive this and live, love, laugh, have children? Who does this? So that human story is very compelling. One of the, separate and apart from the middle passage.
I do want to I'd let you get that last point, but I want to pivot and get some questions from the people who are here and who are online.
Yeah, I just want to touch on Sandy Cornish, because we know about the global slave trade, as it was called. I mean, they were not slaves and it was not trade, but there was also the domestic slave trade, because, unlike the islands, you have a huge mainland. And so by overland, by rivers, and by coastal routes, people were being trafficked mainly from, like they say, the upper South to the lower South. This Fugitive Slave Act, which made this fair game, anybody could be just captured and, oh yeah, well you're an escaped slave. One of the people, Sandy Cornish, was born in Maryland. He and his wife bought their freedom. They got their freedom papers. They migrated to North Florida. A house fire takes place. The freedom papers burn up. He gets captured. He is going to be sold to Louisiana. Sandy Cornish stands up in a public place with a hatchet and begins to mutilate himself. Chops off fingers, cuts his Achilles, basically renders himself useless as a slave. There'll be no market for him. His wife is actually able to sew fingers back on with needle and thread. Anybody who thinks that, slavery wasn't that bad, Anyway, Sandy Cornish he finds his way to Key West, and he becomes one of the most prosperous and prominent citizens in Key West. He has a fruit orchard. He supplies ships that are passing through with fresh fruit and so forth. And when this Emancipation celebration takes place, probably the very first one in the country, the proclamation took effect on January 1st, 1863. As Dr. Hobbs, as you said, only a couple weeks later, by January 28th, the word got to Key West. They have this parade. The news reportage of it is very revealing, because the journalist just uses the N-word and talks about, nothing bad. Along the way, some of the people were pelted with rocks, and the flag was snatched from one of the marches, and the pole broken over his head. But there was no incidents. How the story got told was as interesting as the story itself. But that was in Florida, and one of the many emancipation celebrations that took place. And I would invite you to just Google search any one of those topics: Key West, the African Cemetery, Sandy Cornish, and he was the co-founder of the Cornish Memorial AME Zion Church, which still stands in Key West.
Yes. Thank you for that history. I'm just struck by your descriptions, as well as yours, Brittany, about Key West. And this is something that I find is very true of Florida. It's so beautiful here and so tropical here, and people know it as a tourist destination. It's sometimes hard for people to imagine that Florida was also a site of slavery. It was very prominent here. It was real for us here. And again, I think that also is a part of the resistance to telling the full story and going back and bringing that up. In terms of the sources, people can Google, but they also can go to the website that we have created to gather these stories. It is Florida Emancipation May20.com, Florida Emancipation May20.com. But you can go there and you can actually find an essay that Mr. Tinnie has written. It includes a translation of the newspaper. We have a copy of the newspaper from January in 1863 from the report of that Key West march that talks about Sandy Cornish. We have been gathering from all the regions of this state items to document the observance of emancipation, whether it was in January of 1863 or May 20th and all the years forward. We have photographs, we have recipes spanning many, many decades there. And I just want to acknowledge our webmaster, Koswa Sabia. Please wave to the people. She is the founder and principal of Serious Web Solutions. We go way back to the years at Riley House. I did the first newsletters there. I think she helped me with the first websites there. But if you take a look at that site, it's absolutely beautiful, and that is because of Kia's hard work. And there's a digital archives that is attached to it, as well as a timeline. And this kind of gets back to all of these stories. We have worked really hard to connect Florida's emancipation to all the other emancipation dates. And so if you really want to be able to put it in context, that website, Florida Emancipation May20.com, is where you want to go. We do invite you to be there. I just want to take a minute and ask if there are any questions, either from folks who are here in the room. If you are watching on Facebook, you can enter your questions on the chat, and we'll be able to bring those into the space. Marcia, on this side, please wait for the microphone so folks online can hear you.
I'm trying to understand, where is this Fort Wayne that you mentioned?
Is that in Key West?
Yes.
That's actually Fort Taylor.
Fort Taylor.
Right.
Okay.
It's Fort Zachary Taylor. Right. Right. And that was one of the places where the barracks were built, for the, because it was really a military fort. It wasn't like the prisons and the slave dungeons, but the fact that African people who were rescued who went in there had to wonder, well, what was this? Yeah.
Hello. This is something new. I've never heard of May 20th as a celebration, so thank you for this presentation. And my question is, how have any one of you researched the population history or census of Key West since it was a port of entry for slaves? Did I understand that correctly? Was it a port of entry?
It became kind of a de facto port of entry for captives who were rescued from slave ships. But it was not it wasn't Charleston or New Orleans or Savannah. It was not an auction block port. It was Africans who came through there were under more fortunate circumstances.
Because when my family and I visited Key West, we saw nothing of African, and we were tourists, so
right.
we didn't know what to seek out. We saw the main attractions, but didn't realize that there was such a significant history. I didn't even know it was a slave fort down there.
Yeah, that was you have to go south of Whitehead Street.
Oh, okay.
You have to, there's an area called the Bahamas Village, but the Frederick Douglass High School and the gymnasium and the Elks Lodge, there's quite a bit of, mostly Bahamian rooted, but quite a bit of, African world history in Key West.
So Key
but
West,
not slave, quote unquote, slave trafficking as such, no.
So it wasn't like a Miami Beach where the black population, from what I read, that, you know, in Miami, the black folks were moved to adjacent islands. Miami Beach was black until they gentrified it. Is that a correct? Because I thought maybe that's what happened to Key West as well, but.
I guess it's fair to say there was segregation in Key West, as everywhere in the South. But it was, I mean, and I'm, of course, reporting this secondhand. You know, being on an island that far away, where people have to survive together, there tends to be a lot more harmony. Things did change in the early 1900s when some incident caused a Ku Klux Klan march to happen, and then that was all part of that era of that resurgence of the Klan in the early 20s and all, and that changed a lot of things. You know, there's a Confederate monument, but now there's also a monument to the United States colored troops in the Civil War, because Key West, all through the Civil War, remained under Union control and became a recruiting point for black soldiers, and quite a few came through there. And there's now a bronze statue of a U.S. colored troop soldier in the same park where the Confederates had their little pathetic archway monument. So.
And I know I don't want to
Yeah.
monopolize the fun, Mike, but my daughter here is an artist. She's an illustrator, and she does have a book out called Juneteenth. They Built Me for Freedom, and she brought a copy of the book here with her. So if you would like to see it, it's available on Amazon, and she's done quite a few other books, illustration, children's books. So check it out.
Congratulations.
Broward County Libraries be notified.
Hello, my name is Wallace Tinnie, and I'm from the Florida Black Historical Research Project. I want to thank you all for a wonderful program today on Florida emancipation. I don't really have as much a question as I felt the need to make one statement regarding history and how it's told. Florida basically only had 30 years, more or less, of English slavery. Out of being here for 250 years or 265, as a place where people were coming. So that I like it if people, when they're telling about the history, kind of situate it clearly for the audience, so that the audience knows that the history you're talking about is limited to this time period. Because people seem to think it's the whole time. Florida emancipation, Florida is the emancipation state. Black people lived here for at least a couple of 100 years free. They had little towns here and all kinds of things that these people came in and we don't even know about. I don't even know about them, and I'm saying this right now because they're just mentioned in the history. They're put on little maps. Some Native American will tell somebody, some Army people, oh yeah, that was this town, Mulatto Woman Town, so-and-so town, Angola, this one, all these different towns. I'm saying, well, if all these towns existed, what were they doing? Then you find out they were rich people. People had a lot of money. You have one man whose name is Dave Cantor telling stories about in like the 1800s about all these towns called the Negro plantations or something. You know about all this stuff. And what I'm saying is the history of Florida is in phases, and we need to really make it clear to people. And like she was talking about Key West. Yes, there is history of Key West is in different periods. There were different kinds of things that happened. And yes, at one time, there probably were nothing but mainly Bahamians in Key West, like whenever. I'm not a historian, so I don't really know when that period was. But that's the way it was. And in Palm Beach, there were native, but I think it better, like the Fugitive Slave Act, which was very significant, was not until 1850, although the Constitution did say that if you transported an enslaved person from one state to another. But all I'm saying is, and I know other people need to ask their questions, I wish we would really focus our history and our things so that people who are hearing this can understand that it wasn't all of Florida. That's not Florida history. The little bit of history about emancipation, as far as that proclamation is concerned, was when Florida became a state in 1845. It was a territory in like 1819. So you have like from 1819 to 1865, where you have all this enslavement, and the whole nature of the state changed.
Yes,
from what it was, a freedom state, to crazy place.
Yeah. Well, we
Thank you.
do include those in the timeline that are at the website, and so if you go to the timeline there, I believe we might start in 1804 and move it forward, and we talk about Florida statehood, and so there is definitely some more. Okay. Well, the scope of our project was really focused on emancipation. So, but you're absolutely right. Yeah.
In general, this is what we need to do, because I could hear people not getting
Understood.
what you guys were trying to say.
Thank you.
And there's
Yes.
so many connections that we do have to make, as Dr. Tinnie said. And Dr. Tinnie, as we talked the other evening, and he made a good point of going back to 1526, that we don't normally go back to. But going back to what you said about Florida being an emancipation state, I think we need to shed more information on how the Africans self-liberated themselves before the Emancipation Proclamation. They got the word, and as I think in the video it said, word traveled as fast as a person on horseback or whatever, but they were getting the word everywhere. So by the time they actually signed the papers in Tallahassee, so much of the Black Floridians, so much of not only the Seminoles and the Maroons, had already self-emancipated themselves.
Well, so you're absolutely right, and Florida's history is definitely replete with the southern wing, I guess we could say, of what became known as the Underground Railroad, escaping slavery in British North America through the Spanish. When we talk about Fort Mose, that's a big part of the history of Fort Mose. When you talk about the relationships between Blacks and Seminoles, Dr. Tinnie, of course, is leading that work in preservation and storytelling here in the state of Florida. Very important story. If I believe my great-grandmother, that's our origin genealogy. We've got to do some more work on that one. But the other piece that you are reminding me of, really interesting, during the time that I spent in Virginia and learning about the approach of the Civil War and all of the political conflict that began to brew between the parties, the advent of the Republican Party, and all of the political debates that are raging during the presidential election of 1860, all the way up to Lincoln's victory and swearing in 1861. What's amazing about that is that Black people keenly understood what was at stake. And when you really look at the early battles of the Civil War and what happened almost immediately as these Union troops began to come south, they weren't even prepared to deal with any question of slavery. It was enslaved people who understood that the enemy of my enemy is my friend, that if you were fighting my slave owner, then there may be a better chance for me to be liberated with you. And when these people began to show up at Fortress Monroe up in Hampton and plead the case for their freedom, they are really overwhelming the Union Army generals. They don't have any plan and don't know what to do. But Black people were very clear that this conflict had held in the balance for them the ability for them to achieve their freedom. And you're going to see that over and over again. I think the other really beautiful part of that story is not only their initiative and agency in seeking freedom, but the first thing that they asked for in those Union Army camps was to be taught to read and write. That actually is part of the history of the founding of Hampton, Virginia, which is at that old site, the Fortress Monroe site in Virginia. Thank you for that. Are there any other questions online? Orlando, anything in the chat there? No? Any other questions? Yes, ma'am.
Yes, I had a question. I just want to say thanks for everyone being here and putting this project together. So give thanks to everyone that showed up and is talking to us. And the question that I had does kind of touch on what these two women spoke on beforehand. Because before coming here and watching this documentary, I did know that slavery existed in northern Florida, St. Augustine, and like in Tallahassee and those areas that bordered Georgia. And also plantation, which is just like 20, 30 minutes away from here, because, you know, obviously the name plantation. I didn't know.
That's a new phenomenon. We can talk about that.
Oh, really? I learned that in elementary school. Okay, so maybe, okay, you see, you learn something new. Okay. But I also didn't know that slavery existed or that there were enslaved people in Key West. So that makes me curious to know, were there any safe areas in Florida? Was the entire state of Florida a slave state? You know, I'm just curious geographically.
The entire state was a slave state, just by fact of law, but you have to deal with where the population actually existed. And so Key West was a place, the majority of people generally, and Black people specifically, were all in the northern part of the state. It's hot. It's hot outside right now, and we have air conditioning. This was not inhabitable. I shouldn't say inhabitable because, again, we have to deal with indigenous Americans, but for many people, this was not an area where we see a lot of population, and so it's going to be those enclaves.
Right. If there are areas of the state where people can hide, they hid. But if someone who is part of the slave trade discovered them, they would be pulled into slavery, whether or not they had been formally enslaved or not. So the entire state.
Florida was a part of the Confederacy. Let's be clear about that.
No, that's the key. You know, Florida was not we're not talking Tennessee, with cotton. You didn't really have large-scale plantation slavery here. Much due to, just geography, but also to history. And as my wife Wallace was saying, it's so important to understand that slavery was never monolithic. I mean, it was constantly changing in time. It changes with location. The fact that Florida's emancipation, Tallahassee was the capital, but the fact that most of that was concentrated in the northern part of the state, to the extent that it existed, at all in Florida. But, I think that there's a really important point that we have to come to, and I think we've been alluding to it in different ways. And I guess this matter of agency, the role of African descended people themselves, ourselves, in bringing about liberation. And the language that we use, we have to be very mindful of. And, I've pointed out, for example, I call these, R words, rebellion, revolution, revolt, runaway. In a lot of ways, these are empowering words because they let us know that people did not roll over and passively accept being enslaved. But those words are also reactive. They are as if slavery was a norm. When we talk about runaway, what do you mean runaway? These are people simply asserting their humanity and their right to be alive. And that's what the peninsula of Florida had become for most of the history during the colonial period, a place where people could escape to and escape through, to Bahamas and other places. So there's a very rich history here of non-enslavement and self-assertion.
All right. Thank you. Sure.
One of the reasons I forgot when I was saying that I mentioned what I mentioned has to do with what's going on right now. Right now, we have a governor in our state who has deliberately, openly, and with malice aforethought tried to derail the progress of Black people in Florida. I think we need to understand that this is serious because, as I said earlier, we were free people in this state making a living, doing well for a century and a half. And then the next thing, Andrew Jackson decided that they wanted Florida, or at least they wanted to get rid of those of us who were here because we were making it difficult for slave owners in Georgia and South Carolina. So that everything changed, and all of a sudden, there's no memory of our freedom. The same thing could happen again, people. I know it seems as if we're free now and everything's okay, okie dokie dokie brokey. But the way this country and these people are going, there is no telling of what they're capable. I'm sorry. But I think we need to be aware of our history and how they say if you don't, whatever, it could repeat itself. I don't remember the saying, but you all might remember whatever. You know what I'm talking about.
I know what you're talking about.
Thank you so much.
Those who don't know their history are doomed to repeat it. We have a question to your right, Kurt, but as you're taking the microphone over there, I want to address what the young lady said about a town here in Broward County by the name of Plantation. And I think that actually ties into what Dr. Tinnie is saying in terms of who gets the power to tell the story of history. And even though it's very clear that the Confederacy lost the military battle and that there was this period of thriving and aspiration for Black people, that eventually came to a close. And in order for that to have, you have a return of white supremacy, you had voter suppression, we had lynching. It was through violence and through legal tactics that they were able to reinstate white domination in Florida and throughout the South. And the other thing that they did as a layer on top of that is to change the history and give a particular interpretation of the history that made these defeated Confederates heroic, virtuous. We call it the lost cause. And it involved everything from naming of streets to the establishment of statues, the erection of statues, to history books. And the Daughters of the Confederacy during this period were actually very influential throughout the South. They actually at some point gained control and had great influence on the textbooks that were selected for school children throughout the state. And they would only ratify versions of those textbooks that glorified the Confederacy, that said that slavery was okay, that made these guys heroes. And so the other piece of that is the naming of places. And when you see places like Plantation, when you see a high school whose mascot are the Colonels, that is yet another iteration of the lost cause, this longing for the Confederacy, the legacy of the Confederacy. And let's be clear, these are people who wanted slavery to be kept in place. It's still echoing on our landscape today. People name subdivisions and cities with these romantic Confederate names as a way to detour Black people from living there. Because I could never look for property and live in Plantation. I don't want to live in the Dixie subdivision or off Dixie Avenue or off Stonewall. You know, I want my children to be educated at Stonewall Jackson High School. You know, we have to be mindful of these culture wars that are still ongoing today. And elections have consequences. How we show up have consequences. But the other side of that is that we have the power to tell our own story. And that's what this project is about. That's what the African American Research Library and Cultural Center is about, is where we can come together, share, create, and preserve the things that we believe we need to keep and tell our children.
You know, I went to Key West and I read about the history and discovered that there was a church there that had been burned down by the Klan. And I was expecting to go there and to see a sign that said that the church had been burned down. And do you know there is no such sign? And I'm wondering, is it that putting the sign there would make the church burn down again? Is it as simple as that? Why would you put that sign there?
I'll say I'm glad you brought that up. I go to Key West frequently. I can promise you we will light a lamp rather than curse the darkness. We have some people in good places. Cordy Malcolm, who you saw on in the video, is now heading the what they call like the special collections section of the library. So he has a very ready access to the archive. So if there's any records of that, we can find out where that was, and take care of business. Put the historical marker there.
Which church was that?
Do you know the name of the church by any chance? Oh no, that's there. That's oh, now I have not heard of it being destroyed and rebuilt. Maybe it suffered under hurricanes, but I'll be glad to do the research. But yeah, Cornish Memorial AME is yeah, AME Zion actually, and yeah.
Correct.
How you doing? My name is Woody Claremont. I wanted to just piggyback off that point you made earlier about the romanticizing of slavery and all that, and that there are still a lot of symbols and things that are left behind from that time period that have not been eradicated. For starters, even when you look at the 13th Amendment says, yes, we've ended slavery, but it doesn't say completely ended slavery. It says slavery unless the person shall have been convicted of a crime, which remains on the books to today. And this is why we still have chain gangs and systems in which prisoners are put to use, whether in federal prison or in state prison. And you have some of these admirers that they get reported on in the news or in certain books where they say, oh yes, I see them out there working really hard in the field in their orange outfits. And oh, that just reminds me of a certain time. And oh, I'm glad we still have things like that in our country. And then additionally, the fact that we have the Florida flag, which has the Spanish cross on it, which admittedly, when it was designed to mimic the Confederate flag. And that it was a way of keeping it within our fabric of the state, but yet not fully being as transparent enough as to indicate that, hey, this is what we're doing. We want to maintain this symbol of the Confederacy, but we're just making it slightly different so you don't recognize it. Little things like that I think that we have to constantly keep fighting against. And like you said, with the governor that is trying to pull the wool over our eyes and trying to rewrite history to fool us and trick us, I think it's ultra important that your work continues on as it does, because history is ever so important. We can't lose that, because if you don't know your history, then you don't know the okie doke they're pulling on you every day.
1,000%. Thank you for that. All right. Any other questions, comments from the audience? We really appreciate you being here.
I just have one final thought that
Yes.
I'd like to share with everyone here. So now we know more about emancipation in Florida in May 20th. What are we going to do with what we know? I would just like everyone to think about, so now you have this information, what are you going to do with it?
I think what they need to do. Well, first of all, they have done something. They've come here today to learn. If we, I think the other thing that they can do is come to your emancipation celebration. Charlene, you want to share some information on how Spady, what your celebration will look like this year?
On Sunday, it's going to be a very interesting event. We are going to have an African storyteller. We're going to premiere a play that was written specifically for us. It's called Watchmen, What Remains of the Night, and it's all about watch night. We will have a live band, we'll have music, we'll have activities for children, but we'll have infused the day with information about emancipation in Florida. It's free, it's gonna be a great time. It's from 5 to 8 on Sunday. We would love for you to join us.
Thank you for that.
I'm sorry, that's important. At the Spady Museum in Delray Beach. If you go to spadymuseum.com, all the information is there. spadymuseum.com.
And it's off Atlantic Boulevard on?
Off Atlantic Avenue.
Atlantic
Boulevard is
Avenue.
Atlantic. S like Sam, P like Paul, A, D like David, Y, Museum.
And I think part of the answer to your question is, what do we do with the information? I think recognizing that slavery never ended, it only evolved, to use Brian Stevenson's term, that, we're still fighting for abolition. Right. The criminal system of justice needs to be abolished. Our police departments evolved out of the slave catching industry. I mean, that whole culture of people putting on badges thinking that the real job is to contain Negroes and all of we have work to do, yes.
I'd like to say I represent the Palm Beach County African Diaspora Historical and Cultural Society, and I work very closely with Mrs. Farrington, and because of her, we're having our second annual, quote, May 10th, Emancipation Day. So that's going to be tomorrow at 6. I did bring flyers. Ms. Farrington is one of our key speakers, and we will be looking at, we're having our drumming ceremony, our libation, the performing arts, but we'll be looking at, the untold history of self-liberation. We'll be looking at that untold story of the Southern Underground Railroad as well. And so I'll pass these out. We'd like for everybody to come. It's in Riviera Beach. It's on our website, and that's what we're going to keep doing. That's our pushback to ensure that we keep our democracy that we're living in now. And of course, with Dr. Tinnie, I'm voting for Biden too.
All right. Brittany, you want to tell people where they can learn more about your company and your work?
Yeah, so you can BlairandBlakeProductions.com if you all are interested in any of video services. Blair and Blake Productions. It's BLAIR and Blake BLAKE Productions.com, or you can find me on social media, Instagram, under the same thing as well.
Thank you. And so we're going to wrap up our kickoff for our Celebrating Freedom series. This was the first event. We will be here tomorrow at 4 p.m. Tomorrow at 4, we're going to be holding a celebration for Haitian Flag Day. Our keynote speaker will be Professor Rudy Jean-Bar, who is the Associate Dean for Criminal Justice at Broward College. We're going to have a traditional Haitian dance troupe. We're going to have poetry. It's going to be a really good time, followed by some good old Haitian cuisine afterwards. So if you're not doing anything, please come back. We'll also be celebrating the opening of a new exhibition on Haitian culture that features Christopher Mitchell. He's here in the back. It's called Carnaval Jacmel. I think I said that right. But it features his photography. It's up now. We put it up earlier today, so you can go down the back hallway and take a look at it. But we'll be holding a reception honoring that exhibition opening. So there's that and many, many other things. I should say the conclusion of our Celebrating Freedom series will be a Juneteenth party That's going to be our Destination Freedom Party. It's going to take place on Friday, June the 14th. Friday, June 14th, 6:30 to 9, right here in our lobby. 21 plus event. There will be music. There will be drinks. It's going to be a celebration of Divine Nine culture. So if anybody's a member of a sorority or fraternity, this one is for you. But that'll conclude our Celebrating Freedom series. So thanks again for all of you. I want to thank my partners tonight, Gene Tinnie, Charlene Farrington, and Brittany Flowers for being here. We invite you all to follow us back to our second seminar room. We'll have a reception tonight, so I hope that you'll hang out and continue the conversation. Thank you for being here so much. See you next time.
Can I, one last thing? We'd be terribly remiss. Three of us are members of the Association for the Study of African American History and Culture. No. Life and History, thank you. Anyway, John Henry Clark told us years ago, we need an army of scholars. All of us who have this knowledge, think about joining. We have a South Florida branch. The branch needs membership to strengthen our presence. And this is the organization founded by Dr. Carter B. Woodson in 1915. So it's the Black History organization. It sets the Black History theme every year. This year's theme is African Americans in the Arts.
You have to be a scholar to join?
No, you become one by joining.
Yeah, that instant PhD for coming in. Thank you so much for remembering. We just had our monthly meeting here on Wednesday night. Our next meeting for ASALA South Florida will be on June the 12th. We have sign-up sheets in the back if you're interested. We have some flyers on membership information. So if you're not yet a member of the Association for the Study of African American Life and History, our South Florida branch invites you to come and join us. Thank you.
I just wanted you to know it's a tri-county branch. So our members are Palm Beach County, Broward County, and Miami-Dade.
All right, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.